All right. Well, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to the NYU Law Forum, sponsored by Latham & Watkins. I'm Chris Gottlieb, co-director of the Family Defense Clinic here at the Law School. We are extremely pleased to have two guests in conversation with us today, Andrea Elliott and Joshua Goldfein. Andrea is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter for the New York Times. In 2013, she wrote a series about a young girl named Dasani Coates and her family who were trapped in New York City's homeless system. That award-winning series electrified the discussion around homelessness in New York City just as Mayor de Blasio was coming into office. But Andrea did not stop there. She followed Dasani's family over the next 8 years. The result is a remarkable new book, Invisible Child: Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City. This book has been widely praised as groundbreaking. It is a nonfiction page-turner that reads like a novel while offering penetrating analysis of race and poverty in the United States today through documenting the strengths and challenges of one particular family. The book has already been heralded as a future American classic. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris. I'm really delighted to be here.
Joshua Goldfein is an attorney at the Legal Aid Society's Homeless Rights Project, where he's brought numerous class action lawsuits against New York City on behalf of the homeless, fighting tirelessly for the right to shelter. Josh represented Dasani's family during the time Andrea was writing Invisible Child, and he became a character in the book's narrative. He's an alum of NYU School of Law and of our own clinical program. Thank you so much for being here today, Josh.
The only thing more intimidating than being on a panel with your heroes is looking at the participants and seeing many of your heroes there and knowing that they're watching. So hopefully I won't be too flustered.
It is great to have such an engaged audience here with us. There are so many important discussions that this book could prompt and that I'm sure it will prompt. Today, I'd like to focus us on a couple particular aspects that I think are particularly critical. First, I'd like to talk about what the book reveals about the child welfare system, a system that many now say is more aptly referred to as the family regulation system. This is a system that I have studied for 20 years. It is largely invisible to those who are not enmeshed in it. And I cannot think of a book that better reveals how this system operates and the harm that it inflicts. We're also going to discuss the role of lawyers and journalists in the pursuit of social justice. At the law school, we think a lot about the potential of those roles and their limitations. And this book offers a window, I think, into both of those. But first, I would like to start us off by asking Andrea to read a few of the opening paragraphs of the prologue to the book, which I think give a sense of the power the story she tells has. She's going to begin by referring to Papa, that's Dasani's 8-year-old brother.
Thank you, Chris. October 6th, 2015. First, they came for Papa. The 8-year-old boy asked no questions. He knew to be quiet in the presence of strangers. 2 women led him into a silver van. Papa looked out the window as the ignition started. There was his school, a rectangle of brick that got smaller and smaller as the van pulled away. 11 miles south, another van collected Papa's brother from his school and 4 sisters from their schools, delivering all 6 siblings to the same place, the Staten Island office of New York City's Child Protection Agency. Only the youngest child remained. The van turned east, heading up Laurel Avenue toward a white clapboard duplex with a boarded up window. There, on the sidewalk, stood baby Lily with her father. The toddler hid behind his legs. As the van slowed to a halt, the father wiped his face. His daughter was too little to understand what was happening, that the people in the van were child protection workers, that the court had ordered them to take Lily and her siblings away, that the parents were being accused of neglect, that they had neglected, among other things, the condition of their home.
Gets to me every time, Andrea. Now, I know you didn't set out to write a book about the child welfare system, and yet you begin the book with that moment of family separation. And I'm wondering if you can tell us what led you to that opening.
Yes. I mean, when I entered into Dasani's life, she was 11 years old. This is nearly a decade ago. I thought I would be writing about a homeless child. And I think all these years later, one of the big takeaways I would offer that this book taught me is that the labels that we assign to children like Dasani, whether it's homeless, whether it's poor, are merely the point of departure for understanding their broader human condition. The story revealed itself as it went. And what I did was I entered into her life through one system, thought I had figured that system out, DHS, when lo and behold, wham, she landed in a new system, Child Protection, ACS, Administration for Children's Services. And so each time I was scrambling in real time, you said earlier in a very generous way that this book gives life to, I think, something like that, the harm that this system brings to the lives of poor families. I think in part the reason that is because I didn't set out to write about that. I just was there. I was there for so many years, watching as things happened that none of us could have expected. I'll never forget, of course, the day that the children were taken. It happened in front of me. And I remember coming to various experts after that, including you, Chris, in the weeks and months in the aftermath of this tragic and violent moment for this family of separation, which really is. In almost every case, I would say, very rarely are children separated from families, from parents who want to inflict physical harm. The vast majority of the cases are neglect cases. And so I was scrambling to make sense of events I had witnessed after the fact. And I remember you, Chris, saying to me, a lot of the time reporters come to me and say, I want to write about this. Okay, I need a case and I'll reconstruct it. I was sort of doing the opposite. I had watched it and then I was trying to make sense of it. And every time I had thought I figured out one system, then it was suddenly HRAs, a whole new system, welfare, or DOC, Department of Corrections. These acronyms came to define the arc of Dasani's childhood in such a powerful way. And we could talk about that more later, but it was that family that drew me in to begin with, and those kids, and the bond between the 8 children and their parents that really kind of carried them through. That was the most important system, but it never gets called a system, but it was the anchor of their survival, was their bond with their parents and with one another.
Thank you for that. I think this might be a good moment to share on the screen some images of the family you're talking about and the bond I think that you're talking about. We're going to put up some photographs. These were taken by Nadia Quinn and Ruth Fremsen for the New York Times.
Yes, this is Ruth. This is Ruth Fremsen. Most of this is Ruth Fremsen. I'll just make sure because Nadia did something later, but Ruth was my sister in arms, so to speak. She was the photographer who shot the original series before the book became a book project. That's Dasani, closer to us, and Aviana, her sister, who's they consider themselves twins. Aviana was also named aspirationally for a different bottled water. These were luxury items in the eyes of their mother, Chanel, who herself was named for the perfume, a life that they wanted and that was right in front of them because they were growing up in a very gentrified setting.
Josh, I'd like to bring you into this. And, Andrea, oh, there we go. Andrea, what are we looking at here?
Right here, we're looking at Dasani's 12th birthday. And it was such a moving moment. This was at her grandma Sherry's, the godmother of Chanel, who really raised Chanel, at her house. And she's surrounded by cousins and siblings. And she's remembering in that moment that her counselor at school, which was another home for her, asked her if she had 3 wishes, what would they be? And she said, home, money, and one more wish. So, and she was making wishes about her life in that moment. And her mother had just taught her, after that, she taught her how to cut the cake. But the cake was also stolen from Pathmark. They could not afford to buy a cake. And that's another detail that was just a part of the reality of that moment. And there was nothing inscripted on the top, but a lot of candles.
And let's do one more photo. And I think this is one more contemporary photo of the family now in 2021.
This is Nadia Quinn, and yes, that's them today. Dasani on the left, Chanel in the middle, their mom, and Aviana on the right. They've been reunited after a long fight in court that I would argue was largely led by Chanel as the de facto lawyer until David Lansder came in, and then together they worked to get the kids back. But for a long time, she was a lone warrior with Josh's help as well on the side, but very much front and center to her case. And Dasani on the left there stood up, and we can talk about that later, and argued to be returned to her mother. So she's now 20, and she's, we could talk about what's happening with her later, but yes, it's a beautiful shot.
So Josh, if you would tell us how you came into this family's life, what sort of the work you were doing at the time. Andrea had referenced DHS. I know that's an acronym you deal with on a day-to-day basis. So if you could tell us about your work and how you came to get to know the family.
Yeah, and we have to distinguish between our DHS and the federal one. In New York City, the Department of Homeless Services operates the primary shelter system. There are other shelter systems, but New York is unique in that there is an absolute right to shelter, unlike in any other jurisdiction. And that responsibility falls on the New York City Department of Homeless Services. There are other agencies that can serve other populations, but if you have nowhere else to go, then DHS has to take care of you. And this family was living in a New York City Department of Homeless Services shelter in Brooklyn called Auburn, which was a terrible, terrible place as a result of the series that has since been improved and serves a different population now. But we had a number of cases over the years pending that involved the shelter system and the conditions at that location in particular. And as Andrea mentioned, this was an unusual situation in that we do a lot of press advocacy. We have instances where we have a client who we think whose interests would be served by using media advocacy. And so we would reach out to reporters and try and get someone interested in the story. And sometimes, of course, reporters approach us and say, I'm interested in this issue. Do you have a family that we could describe in the story? It would be a lot more compelling story if we tell it through a family. And this was a very unusual situation in that Andrea called and said, I have a family I'm working with, and I need your help to understand what's going on. So in that respect, it was very unusual. But once we were involved, we try to use every available tool to assist our clients. And litigation often is the last resort. It's the least effective tool that we have in many instances. We do legislative advocacy, we do administrative advocacy, we do press advocacy, we do community organizing. And this very quickly, when we understood what the project was, it became clear that we had an opportunity here to achieve things that we could not achieve in court, maybe ever, including getting children out of the Auburn shelter. I know Andrea can talk more about what she found there, but that was a place that was, kind of out of the 19th century and right in the middle of Fort Greene.
Andrea, if you would talk a little bit more about what you saw at Auburn, and then ultimately, even when the family is able to move out of there and into another place, that's the home that is ultimately called neglectful in terms of the housing conditions. So I wonder if you can tell that piece of the story.
Yeah, sure. So what I saw at Auburn first was nothing because I wasn't allowed in. It really felt like this other world that was intentionally off limits to the public, the press. And eventually Ruth Frempson and I snuck our way in by going through the fire escape door in the back, setting off alarms and running past 4 sets of security guards. That was only after Josh was the family's lawyer, and the New York Times felt that it was a little still risky, of course, because we were putting the family at risk, but potentially more defensible on a sort of ethical level because they had representation should our presence be found out. But this entire thing had to be reported under the radar, because I was convinced that the city would shut the story down, would find a way to move the family somewhere else. So Auburn was a dreadful place. This was a shelter where Dasani spent a quarter of her childhood, 3.5 years, living for most of that time in one room, crammed with her 9 family members, trying to get rid of the mice, fixing the plumbing herself, the sink that was rotting, noticing the mold on the walls, and yet really trying to make the best of it. At the same time as she was doing her best to advance herself at school. She'd landed on the honor roll shortly after I met her. She was the fastest kid on the block, running wise. She wanted to go to the Olympics. She was like brimming with hope. And at the same time, carrying this horrible burden of the life of what it is to be poor, which is a real high wire act of survival. And I think I just obviously had I had spent time in many different communities as an outsider. I lived for weeks in northern Morocco in a slum where there was no running water. I mean, I'd been to a lot of places as a reporter, but I really didn't understand what it was like in my own city, which was the richest city in the world, or one of them, with the highest concentration of rich billionaires in the world, what it was like to grow up poor there, what it was like to struggle every day to get through the labyrinth of systems that continued to befuddle me for a long time, the acronyms and how did they interact with one another, and how do I even map this out for the reader? It's just this acronym and that acronym and all the language around the systems, all of which Dasani was fluent in. Dasani showed me the story at every turn. And I remember this one day, because you were asking about systems and how does DHS, these are punitive systems, yet they have names that suggest help. So it's things like child protection, or the way that we know these systems, and criminal justice. And yet what Dasani sees as these systems as is something she has to live with and she has to survive. They are acronyms that exist as a map in her mind, which is actually now at the front of the book, that is a parallel map of the city. So DHS, Department of Homeland Services, to her is the Bronx, HRA is Queens, ACS is Brooklyn. That to me was revelatory, because we need to be able to understand what this life is like for the nearly half of New Yorkers who are near or below the poverty line as of at least 2018. There's been a study every year of this. I mean, this is a huge population, more than 100,000 kids in and out of shelters in the last year in the city. So the idea that there can just be such a divide between these two populations, and yet an incredibly close encounter by virtue of gentrification, was at the heart of trying to understand the story and reporting it the way I did.
Thank you for that. And the systems you're talking about, today we hear much more the idea that there's structural racism embedded in these systems. And I'm going to ask both of you, maybe Andrea, if you'll start us off to talk about, what that phrase means to you. Would you describe what you saw as entailing structural racism? And if so, what's the architecture of that? What did it look like in your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So my reporting started in 2012, long before this much needed and long overdue racial awakening in America really took flight, and where our language, our common language for describing things like white privilege, systemic racism, it wasn't there yet. And yet it was there every day in my conversations with Chanel. And I'm sure Josh can speak to this as well, because he had a very constant conversation with Chanel. This was front and center. She was showing it to me before it even had the language that that I came to understand as what it is. And so, for example, I mean, I would say that there are two very, very clear examples of systemic racism in this family story. One goes back to the great-grandfather of Dasani, June Sykes, who fought when the military was still segregated in Europe as part of the 92nd as a Buffalo Soldier, the only infantry, all Black infantry to fight in Europe in World War II, survived 3 major battles, came back with medals, and yet as a Black veteran was denied the very support that his white comrades got, through the GI Bill to start businesses and buy homes and train for jobs. And that isn't just like he went another way. There's a very concrete way to see and to understand that different trajectory and what it meant. The white veteran who went to the suburbs that through restrictive covenants made it impossible for June Sykes to do the same, was able to buy a home, to then plant the seeds for a intergenerational wealth. People always talk about the cycle of poverty, that poverty leads to poverty. Wealth also creates wealth generation after generation. White Americans eventually amassed 10 times the median net worth of Black Americans. And I think so much of the story is there with housing and those barriers that he faced that relegated him not only to being a renter stuck in public housing, but made it impossible for him as a trained mechanic who repaired military vehicles under fire to join the largely white, very exclusive labor unions that catered to white workers in his own trade. And I looked with Chris Weimer at Columbia at the difference between those two salaries. He wound up mopping floors. What he made as a janitor over the next 20 years, working crazy hours. I have all his wage records compared to what he would have made were he allowed to work in his profession, amounted to nearly $200,000 in lost wages. That is a safety net. That is the foundation of generations after you being able to then rely on your parents or your grandparents for help avoiding some kind of disaster. That didn't exist in this family. And I think it's such a clear example. And the other, I think Josh should answer this too, but the other example, of course, is the child protection system, because it was just abundantly clear through the data. The vast majority of the families in this system are Black or brown. 2015 was the year that I witnessed these kids being taken. That year alone, only 2% of the cases of children who were removed from of allegations were abuse only. 7% were abuse and neglect. 93% were just neglect. And there's a very, very important distinction to be drawn between the abuse cases and the neglect cases. This is a neglect case. Neglect is failure to provide. It's failure to provide adequate housing, adequate clothing, enough food. These are so closely correlated to poverty. And so when you've got this overrepresentation of Black and Hispanic families in a system where the parents don't know their rights for the most part, where there is an abundant lack of due process, it's astonishing to me that this isn't more of a story, that this isn't in the paper every day, frankly. It just feels like a huge and important story for us to reckon with.
And Josh, can you speak a little about what you see, and particularly those aspects you think there should be more attention paid to?
I mean, I'm so hopeful that this book will help people see what we see every day. Andrea talked about the statistics that the shelter system is overwhelmingly occupied by people who are Black and brown. We look at the who gets removed from their families and placed into foster care and see the same disparities. But to shift from the sort of quantitative to the qualitative, I think you could talk to anybody who works in this field who would say, for instance, in looking at child welfare cases, the kinds of allegations that are used to remove children from their homes are the kinds of things that happen in all families, that certainly happen in white families. And I think if we looked at our own families, I know in my own family, if you looked at some of these situations, you would say, of course, that happens every day. Everybody uses drugs. Everybody, has a tough time. Everybody has struggles with their, with their landlord, for instance. And yet it's the same patterns that repeat themselves in terms of who has to face the brunt of the state action in these situations. And it's particularly galling. Andrea talks about this alphabet soup of agencies, in this case in particular, where turned out maybe not to be the actual reason, but certainly at the beginning of the family court case that ended in that scene that Andrea read from, was an allegation that the family's apartment, their home, was not properly maintained. But there was a city agency that was responsible for doing that had failed to enforce the law, that had failed to do what it was supposed to do. And yet the family was held responsible for that. Those are the kinds of things that our clients expect that Black and brown people are subjected to on a daily basis. That people are just treated worse, and that those when you have a daily expectation that you're going to be treated that way, that's its own trauma. But when you couple that with the history that Andrea is able to trace, I think this is a unique case study in that she's able to contextualize the history of the redlining and the exclusions from federal aid and from schools, and trace it to, not just in a hypothetical sense, but here is an actual family. Here are people who are living in New York City today. And here is the very specific ways in which they were denied opportunities that were available to other people.
And with all you've come to understand about how the systems compound rather than solve the problems of poverty, Josh, I guess, can you talk about your level of optimism for the role lawyers can play in that? And I know you do some systemic work, some individual representation. You mentioned press advocacy. I mean, you're talking to some law students here, and what's your message in terms of our ability to push back against some of this?
Well, that's a very big question for a humble legal services lawyer. We of course have clients. So for each person or family that we represent, we want to vindicate their rights and make a difference in their lives. We do try to bring impact cases or address problems through legislative advocacy, as I mentioned, or class action work. But the key to all of that is having the individual clients. But in the bigger picture, the answer is political power and changing who gets a seat at the table, and that is maybe a bigger project than is available to at least to a legal services lawyer.
Andrea, could you speak a little bit to, I know that, Dasani's family had several lawyers involved throughout the course of the time you were working with them. And if you could start us off on your sense of the roles lawyers were playing for good and for ill in their lives.
Sure. I mean, the heartbeat of every conversation about lawyers that I've had with Chanel, with Supreme, Dasani's, the person she considers to be her dad, her stepfather, with even Dasani as well, with her brother Khalik, who's now at Rikers. It's always the same thing. It's, I want them to fight for me. Usually it's said with some kind of sort of cynicism that will happen, or skepticism, I should say. I would argue that what they're saying is, I want them to fight with me, because they're fighting every single day in these various systems, criminal and family. I think that there, every once in a while, comes along a lawyer like Josh or like David Lanzner, who makes them feel like there's some hope that there are lawyers out there who will actually read the complaint, or, because so much of the time what I saw in court with Chanel was her almost like a puppet guiding her lawyer through the proceeding. She was really kind of the best lawyer without a law degree I've ever met. I mean, she was really good at mounting her own defense, and she just, I think she had to learn that because there was often enough, just the lawyers that she wound up with were overworked, or they had too much going on. But she's had a lot of good experiences, I would say, over the years. And so she's had plenty of experiences, both good and bad. But I think that there isn't so much, it's not about the lawyers so much as just a deep distrust of the system. The courtroom itself like a symbol of that, and the judge. And often the people in positions of power are white, and the people who are being accused of something are not. And so that's just clear to anyone who's even visiting, right? That it's just kind of stark in New York City. But it's also true that like Dasani's favorite show continues to be Criminal Minds, that she's, she wanted to be a prosecutor, and I don't think she wants to do that anymore. But there is this romanticization of like the lawyer who comes in and saves the day. So I think it's a mixed picture. It's complicated.
Well, there's actually a particular scene in the book that I want to talk about for a moment, because I do think it brings out some of these quite layered complications of the roles of lawyers in dealing with these systems. There's a scene that takes place just outside the Staten Island Family Court after Chanel has just had a very tough court appearance. The judge had previously excluded her from her own home, separating her from her children. But at this point, she was really working hard to try to do what Children's Services was demanding of her. She had tested negative for drugs, and your book explains how she was hopeful that day that she would be allowed to move back in with her family. But the caseworker for Children's Services says only negative things about her in the courtroom, doesn't give her credit for any of the efforts she's been making. She has a court-appointed lawyer at that point. I think she's frustrated with that lawyer's representation, and she's particularly frustrated with the caseworker. And they come out and they really get into it, and they practically come to blows. The book explains how, Josh, you stepped into that dynamic and tried to de-escalate the situation somewhat. And for me, that was a particularly poignant scene, because I think it brought to life the tensions that some of us feel as lawyers representing clients that we know they are justifiably furious. And yet we have to try to figure out if there's a useful role for us in dealing with that fury that doesn't become part of condoning or being complicit in the system. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about your take on that moment and what it was like for you.
Yeah, that was a horrible day. I'm not a lawyer who appears in family court on any kind of regular basis. I was there in part because the allegations in family court were about the housing conditions, and in part because, as you mentioned, Chanel was kind of acting as her own lawyer, and the lawyer that she had been assigned was not representing her as she felt adequately, and so she wanted me there to sort of prod him. And yet, of course, because those lawyers are, running in and out of the courtroom, they have 1,000 cases on. I was the person kind of standing there in where a lot of the action actually takes place, which is outside the courtroom in the waiting room, and ended up in this confrontation. Marika Diaz from the Safety Net Project at the Urban Justice Center has a great article in the CUNY Law Review recently about movement lawyering and what's the difference between movement lawyering and more traditional kind of legal services work. And one of the things she says is you have to be willing to be laughed at court if you're a movement lawyer. You have to be always questioning the system and confronting the ways in which playing by the rules reinforces the system. And that's totally true. And we are. There are times when we bring cases that were claims that we feel like maybe they're not going to prevail, but we have to say it. And sometimes that's strategic in sort of framing your claims and trying to make the more reasonable claims look more reasonable. But this is a situation where the client wants to take the most extreme position, to be confrontational, to have her rage felt and heard and acknowledged. And that's a totally legitimate desire on her part. That's a completely human reaction. In fact, it's traumatic to have to suppress that. For her to stand there and watch this happen to her family recognizing how unjust it is and how no one who's involved in the system is doing their job, and no one is helping her. To ask her to say, put all that aside and let's just focus on this narrow technical question of, did you have this drug test on this day or not? It's just asking too much of a person to put them in that situation. But on the other hand, as the lawyer, as the person who was there to represent her interests within the system, that was a moment where it was very early in the case. It was, as some of the greatest parent advocates in New York City are in the audience for this, so any of them could tell you the beginning of this case. This is a pivotal moment. I mean, if the judge is hearing that the children need to be removed, and if the reaction of the parent is to come into court and attack people in the courtroom, in the presence of the court officers, physically, with physical violence, that's going to potentially dictate what happens with these children for years. And so I was in the position of having to counsel my client, look, there's everything that you're saying is true about this system, that it is rigged against you, that it is racist, that it is tearing your family apart for only bad reasons. But at the same time, there are rules here. And if you follow the rules, if you play their game, they will give you what you want. And, we can channel all this rage. We can call Joyce McMillan at the end of this court day and talk about what happened. But we have right now, here we are standing in the, we were actually in that court is in trailers. It doesn't even fit in the courthouse. And so we were kind of standing outside a trailer. But, it's a very porous situation. There's court officers and lawyers and even the judges and their law assistants kind of walking in and out of this space, in front of all of these people. You have to right now, well, you don't have to. I mean, I'm the lawyer, I'm not the client. But if you are able to sort of rein it in and make this appointment and work with her to set up the schedule for the kinds of visits that she wants and the appointments that they're all insisting that you have to do, many of these are pointless. It's a huge waste of your time. It's setting you up to fail. It's not even compliant with the law that we should be trying to reunite this family unless there's a reason why we can't. But if you do all that, you will get your kids back, probably. And if you instead, send this caseworker to the hospital from the courtroom itself, that will make this case a lot harder. And that was, when I read the words on the page, I thought, oh my God, did I really say that? But I know that Andrea, of course, has her secret microphones hidden everywhere. And so sure enough, those were the actual words. So the record is the record. But yes, that was,
to be clear,
I work a hard day.
I work with a LiveScribe pen, which Dasani came to refer to as my spy pen, but I was always very clear that it was recording, but you probably forgot. Record sound, and then it also, it's I just don't trust my memory. I had more than 100 hours worth of audio recordings over the course of this. One of my favorite things about that moment was, first of all, I just want to say I'm a mom. I have 2 girls. If somebody told me that they were being taken away, I would lose my shit completely and have absolutely zero decorum. We've all heard the stories of the mom who lifts the car up off of her child's body. There is nothing more powerful than that bond. And the idea that there are agencies in this country with the power to disrupt that bond without a real form of sort of due process of parents knowing their rights is astonishing. So she was so justifiably angry. But what she was saying to Josh in that moment was, I just want to whoop her ass. And the way that what was brilliant about Josh's approach was that he did not deny her that. What he said was, okay, can we make that number 2? And then he just got her to smile because she was like, oh my God, you're so useless. You would never be able to whoop anyone's ass. You, Josh. And then it got her to to trust again. Like, this is a good person. He's on my side. He's agreeing that the system sucks, but he's also he's in my corner. So I'm going to just listen to him. Yeah.
I don't think I could have kicked Marisol's ass, but I'd like to believe that I could lift the car off my child.
Exactly. Yeah.
Andrea, could you talk about, watching this, really intense stuff unfold? I know you're coming from a very different position as the journalist observer. Josh has constraints or complications because he might hate the system, but his job is to get an outcome for his particular client. You also have constraints, and I know you're trying to bring this story to the larger world, but can you talk about what that's like for you to watch in real time some harm being done, and what you see as your role in that moment?
It's an extraordinarily complicated job. And I think that what I will say in a big picture sense is that I never feel entirely comfortable I have the perfect answer. I'm, especially after a day like that, I'm shaken, I'm human. I've learned to wear both hats and to acknowledge and honor those two parts of myself, that I'm there as an observer to do work. And I'm also a human being, a mother, someone who cares for the people around her. And by the way, there were some extraordinary people on the child protection side, Linda Lowe in particular, who worked for Foundling, who gathered the courage to go on the record and call out the system in her own way, but who also really advocated for Chanel as best she could. Systems are people. And so it's fascinating to me always, but yes, as a reporter and as a person who cared, juggling those two things, reconciling those two things was a huge part of the work. And what I came to see was that having big feelings about what I was seeing wasn't just okay, it was almost necessary to breathing life onto the page, to basically, I see this book as a series of attempted acts of witness. I don't call it, acts of witness. I see that as I felt that was the most important thing I could do, was to take note and to share this with a broader audience, with any audience. So this is playing out every day and people don't even know these stories. And then to try to make sense of it. One thing I would love to say also is, first of all, I want to acknowledge my amazing colleague, Nina Bernstein, who wrote the seminal book, The Lost Children of Wilder. We have known for decades about the systemic racism that is at root here. It's just that it persists, and as Chanel puts it herself, it doesn't seem to change. The cycle feels so unbreakable. Another person who was really interesting for me to talk to was Nora McCarthy, who was then at Rise. I remember her saying to me, because I was trying to make sense in real time. My God, they're suddenly in this prevention program with Foundling, and the whole point of this program is to prevent worse things from happening. But what they really need is help restoring their food stamps. Basically, they need a lawyer, or just someone to work the phones. They need practical help. Instead, they're being told to do parenting classes and go to therapy. I don't believe Chanel and Supreme needed parenting classes. I actually don't. I think when they were solid in terms of food, when they had their needs met and they weren't stressed out of their minds, they were as good a parent as anyone. And the idea that they suddenly had to prove themselves. And I remember Nora saying to me, well, think about it this way. When families of means are in crisis, their neighbors, their friends, they don't respond by saying you need to go to therapy. They come with a casserole, right? But when poor families are in crisis and enter the surveillance of various systems, including this one, the response is to add to the pressures. It's not to relieve them. Nobody was bringing Supreme a casserole, which he actually really needed. They were saying, in addition to having all these problems with your house, ultimately, I will read you one paragraph about that because I think it just nails the case and what happened, that he now has to do all this other extra work. In addition to taking care of 7 children, Dasani was in boarding school, Chanel was homeless, he was by himself. I mean, that's a very good way, a very promising way to break up a family. You're going to make it impossible for him to succeed. You know, and I'll just say, I mean, the federal government gives 10 times the funding to programs that separate families than to prevention programs. And I think that that's astonishing. At the very end, on October 6th, I wrote, I'm just going to read you this paragraph that, you know, housing inspectors had come by. He had let them in a few days before, but that day he didn't hear them. And ACS caseworker was also there. She took note of this. And then everything, just his fate is sealed. It doesn't matter that he's been calling 311 to try to get these problems in his home fixed. The fact that he made these calls will go unmentioned in court. Instead, ACS will give the impression that the agency discovered and is now preventing a disaster in the making, a group of untended children who they're just, by the way, they're described as unkempt and dirty, smelly, and having a foul odor. This is because their gas and electricity were cut off and they were unable to bathe, they were rotating. And that wasn't his fault. That was another bureaucratic lapse. That they're arriving late to school, that there are no window guards, the sink is off the wall, the ceiling is leaking all day. The agency wants the children removed. Judge Lim asks ACS why Supreme and the children cannot enter the city's shelter system, given that their home is a quote unquote disaster. This should make them eligible for shelter. The ACS lawyer pushes back, saying that Supreme does have housing right now that can be repaired. In other words, the problem is Supreme's neglect of his home and therefore his children. It's a safety issue at this point, the lawyer tells Judge Lim. These are things that could have been remedied. And with that, it's done. He orders them to take the children, put them in foster care, and they go into a system that winds up spending $33,000 a month on these 8 children, to separate them from their families rather than, and Linda Lowe from Foundling is the one who said to me, I always wondered, why couldn't they just take a fraction of that money and provide supports, a person in Supreme's home, an aide who could just be there to help him. We don't know what those supports would look like. There are some programs, Chris, you can speak to this more than I can, but it represents such a tiny minority of the families who get those supports.
Unfortunately, just a fraction. And I, you know, the parent activists who really are leading the charge to push back against the way the family regulation system handles these issues. I say again and again that you're not giving families what they actually need. You're, you know, as you just said, Andrea, you're giving us more stress, burdens. You're punitively judging us and making our lives harder. You're not giving us, you know, the basic material supports that we need. You know, you explained how, you know, this led to the children going into foster care, that heartbreaking removal. And I want to take us to another scene, amazing scene in the book, in the courthouse later, after the children have been taken, because it's one in which Dasani is there in the courtroom, and Chanel wants her to speak to the judge. And it really striking dynamic where Dasani's lawyer says she doesn't need to speak. I will speak for her.
A white lawyer, I will add. Yes.
Important to note. In fact, there were many lawyers involved with this family's life. I believe every single one of them was white. Although, you know, as you mentioned, at least all the lawyers I think assigned to represent the family were white. Although, as you said, you know, the vast majority of children in foster care in New York City are Black. Black and brown, but particularly Black families overrepresented. And there comes this moment where Dasani's lawyer says the judge doesn't need to hear from her, but Chanel wants the judge to hear directly from her daughter. and the new lawyer, David Lanzner, who you mentioned earlier, another alum of NYU, who's been a leading family defense attorney, has come into the case, and at Chanel's urging, he demands in the courtroom that the judge hear from Dasani. I'm not going to give the spoilers for people who I hope are going to read the book, but Dasani ultimately does speak in her own voice, and it's very very powerful. And I wonder, both of you, Josh, if you come back in and speak a little about what does this mean about the lawyer's role of, are we amplifying clients' voices? Are we getting in the way? What are we doing? What should we be doing?
I mean, David's one of those great lawyers who can push the boundary and get away with it and still be effective in representing his client. He never fails to point out the hypocrisy, the ways in which the system is rigged against his clients, and he does it in court. Standing there and in family court, it's just a kind of a go along to get along kind of place. Again, I mean, I talked about as an outsider in advising Chanel in that moment. It was a lot easier for me because I'm not part of that system every day. But most of the people who practice in family court are there every day. They're in front of the same judges. They're dealing with the same lawyers on the other side, the same agency staff. To kind of blow it all up and say, this is an outrage, what is happening in this courtroom, and by implication, the way you are doing business, in the 12 other cases you had on today, and every single day. David is very effective at capturing that. I mean, I remember him standing there and saying to the judge, "She's right there. She's sitting right here, Judge. Why don't you just ask her?"
Right.
And that's the kind of thing that, I'll leave it to the clinical staff to, help young lawyers develop what the skill to sense when is the moment when you can push a judge in that way. But, I mean, if there are judges who would have held him in contempt for that. But, David has the gravity to pull that off. And that is what had to happen. I mean, she was sitting right there. The record needed to include what she wanted.
Andrea, what was your sense in the room at the time when Dasani finally is able to speak for herself to the judge?
I mean, I see that as, and I think David Lanzner would agree with this, it was Chanel directing David, who then made it possible to give the stage to Dasani, who then, without giving it away, I don't know how to say it without giving it away, but gave one of the most profoundly moving cases for why she should be with her mother, and was unafraid. And this was a judge that the family really liked, Kamanjian. The case had moved to her court, and she, she was very attentive. She listened to Dasani, and at one point she said, "Nobody doubts that your love for your family, nobody doubts that long after this case is over, you will always be a family." And Dasani just jumped in and said, "How can you call this a family when I can't even go to my little sister's kindergarten graduation? That is not a family." It's just, I think when people are empowered to speak their own truth, almost nothing is more powerful, right? It's so essential to hear from the client. I don't know. I say that, and then I think of all these lawyers, especially in criminal context, who are like, no, they should never speak. In this case, they needed to speak. They needed to feel that they did this. But I see Lanzner in that situation almost as someone who grabbed control of the spotlight and moved it to another part of the stage, and then Dasani jumped on. He had the power to do that, but he made it possible for her to be seen and heard. Which it's ridiculous that even is the case, that she can't herself do that. But
I love that metaphor of the spotlight, because I do think we do talk a lot in the clinic about whether there are ways to use our privilege as professionals in the system to shift where the focus of that spotlight is. I want to turn to some of the questions we've gotten from audience members. In particular, we got one, what do Dasani and her family feel about the book and the article and their impact, the impact on their life? And Andrea, I know you have a useful answer to this question.
Yeah, well, so I saw that. It was a great question. And I was texting with Dasani just a little while ago, and I said, oh, I'm doing this panel, and Dasani will eventually come out and speak. She's still kind of feeling like she's not quite ready, but she does love to give me answers. So I wrote, okay, here's the question. What does Dasani think of the book? And this is her response. That's a great question. Well, if I'm being completely honest, I feel that the book is an amazing story where people get to know my story, and for others who have similar situations like mine, to know that they're not alone and that they are going to get through it. God only puts obstacles in your way that he knows you can conquer. So for me, I love the book. That's so Dasani because she feels very proud of her own abilities, as she should, her own agency to get through things. And, you know, then I asked her about the series and what if it had never happened? And, you know, would your life have been different? She wrote, well, I feel I still would have accomplished certain goals in my life, like graduating or playing sports. And then we're texting back and forth because I said, I remember deciding when the series ran, there was all this sort of like cynicism around the way that she suddenly became this political pawn for the de Blasio administration. She was on the inaugural stage and she was this symbol, and it was this brief moment of fame. And people were saying, you know, oh, they're just using her, whatever. And I asked her about that a few years later, and she said, no, I don't see it that way. I think I was inspiring people. And so we were talking about that again today. And she said, it changed my life, being in, you know, this on the front page or whatever, by letting me see to never let hardship stop you or push you back in life. Take that and use it as fuel to do better things. So in a way, it's like the reaction to the series and the fact that she got so much attention held up a mirror to her own strength. It was like, you know what, I can be an inspiration. So therefore, in that sense, I think it was influential. But you know, there's so much to say on this. I would never take away from Dasani or Chanel's agency at so many junctures of this story by saying that my presence made certain things happen. Of course, I also understand that, for instance, the Hershey School may have seen a media opportunity in the fact that I was writing a book. Her sister didn't get in. She worked very hard to get in. It was a long process, and it was hard for me to get access. Nonetheless, I did. And what would have happened had I not been there, we'll never know. But what I do know is that what I saw was entirely real. It was Dasani trying her best to do something, carry something out, a vision that her public school principal had come up with, which was that she needed to leave Brooklyn and leave her neighborhood and by extension, her family, in order to transcend their problems. And I think that that's a very controversial notion that we accept as fact, that to depart from poverty, you need to depart from self, you need to leave. I think that Dasani would say, no, she should be able to thrive in her own neighborhood and with her family and her culture intact. So I think that you know, so many things happen in this story, and it's part of the reason I stayed there for so many years. I just felt that it was never the right time to stop. In fact, I wrote the ending 3 different times, and all 3 endings are in the book. They just are chapter endings instead of the real ending, because things just kept happening that were both revelatory and astonishing and sometimes heartbreaking, but ultimately just really about the fact that this family, more than anything, is what mattered to Dasani and matters to her. It's the core of her existence, is her relationship with them.
And of course, the family does survive. There is no ending to the family. There is an ending to the book, at least for now. We have another question from an audience member, which I'm going to put to you, Josh, which is, what do you hope comes from the book? The piece of this family story that is in the book. There will be other chapters, whether they're written or not, but the book, what do you hope it accomplishes as it goes out into the world?
Well, once again, I have a client. So my first answer is always, about the client, and also kind of responding to what Andrea just said. Chanel, many times throughout this process, talked to me about, without revealing any client confidences, the end. You can see in the end product that there is a lot of material in this book that is not the kind of thing that most of us would not want to have our lives laid out on the page in this way in all their gory detail. And Andrea's very, very careful reporter, obtained tremendous amount of material, and we had a lot of conversations about, do you want this to be in the book or not? But ultimately, my client felt that it was in her interests to continue to participate in this project, and for two reasons, I think. Number one was, as Andrea said, there was a spotlight on them and doors open for them that would not have opened for many of our other clients. When people got the paperwork and they saw the names on it, and a little bell went off, and then they would call me and say, is this Dasani design? And things would happen. People wanted to help them. There's nobody who read those stories who wasn't affected by them. And so she understood that she had a certain amount of power that came from being the subject of this project while it was going on, because there was this long period where the stories had appeared. And now, when was the other shoe going to drop? There's a book being written. What's going to be in the book?
7 years.
and so from an extremely individual level, the book project was a benefit to the client. Saw this project as a benefit to her. And there's another aspect of this, which I have to plug, that there is a trust. It has happened before that we've had clients whose stories appeared on the front page of the New York Times, and people sent in money and to help them, and we knew that was going to happen again, and so we enabled them to have a way to receive that. So there's a trust that benefits the children, and the information is in the book, and money is coming in even now as the book has been published. People want to help.
They need help, and the trust is called Invisible Child Trust, and it's on Twitter. You can Google it and you'll see it. It's on my website as well. But this family has 8 kids to put through college. Just back to you, but I want to say that.
And so the family saw the book project as a not just this nebulous kind of resource, but as an actual resource in terms of dollars. So that has to be part of the answer. But as I mentioned before, we have stories. Every lawyer has a story. Sometimes you have a client where you say, look, I can't win this in court, but if the Daily News wrote a story about this, we would win, and we still do that today. There were getting kids out of Auburn. That happened because of this. People who have read even the first couple chapters of this book have said, I want to give this to every elected official in the United States. If people read this, they would understand why the way how the what do we say, that it's not that the system has failed, the system is working exactly as it was designed, right? This is the insight of critical race theory. If we're gonna dismantle the system and make it work for people, you have to understand what it does to people, and this, Andrea has captured through Dasani and her siblings and her parents being willing to tell their story, how harmful these systems are to people, and we can only hope that people read it and take the right lesson from it.
Can I just jump in for 1 second? One of the ways to grapple with the incredible complexity in terms of ethics and morality around this work, I think, is to encourage the people you're writing about to seek out other opinions. In fact, when I first met Dasani and her family, I said, here are all my stories. Do you want to talk to anyone I've ever written about in a really meaningful way? Like the imam I followed around for 6 months. Do you want to talk to him? I'll give you his cell phone number. You can ask him if I was there. It was a little risky. I felt it was really important not to ever be a part of Dasani's therapy, for example. Those scenes in the book are reconstructed based on notes and interviews later after the therapeutic relationship ended. And I said to her, therapy is a sacred space. My mother's a therapist. I know this. I've been in therapy. I know it. You should feel free to talk about anything, including me and how annoying I am in those. That is nothing. I'm not even touching that. Same thing with Josh and Chanel. It's the first time I'm hearing you, Josh, say that that your client thought the book was a benefit. You know, there were lots of debates and discussions back and forth. I had to be so careful about the issue of money, and I talk about this at length in the afterword, and I would encourage any of you to read that so that we don't take up time there. But absolutely, I could not attach some kind of financial advantage to participating in something that requires being so vulnerable. I mean, it would have been extremely wrong to do that. And at the same time, it was always in my mind, always, that once the reporting was entirely, the book was finished, I would tell the family that I, of course, intended to, should, most books don't, but should this book actually succeed, to share in any proceeds. And, and I'm really hopeful that that will happen, and that others can also give to this trust. It's absolutely, without question, a vital thing. I think that we do that, but you don't want it to be in any sense coercive. You don't want it to feel like, oh, I have to do this because I'm going to get this out of it. Anyway, so I'm just clarifying. We have different roles. I was grateful. And I knew there were lots of conversations happening with Josh about me, and I didn't know what they were, but I was grateful. Tell Chanel whatever you want, tell her not to talk to me. She needs to know she has other people in her corner who are coming at it from a different angle. And it just makes me feel more secure in the process as well.
I so appreciate that both of you are acknowledging that there just aren't easy answers here, and sort of the relationship between storytelling and advocacy. Lawyers struggle with how to ethically use stories persuasively, but the story is someone's life. And I hear you saying, Andrea, that there's a different relationship between storytelling and advocacy in your work, but also no easy answers about how to do justice.
I'm an advocate of great journalism. That much I will say.
Well said. So I think we have time for just one more question, and this is, I'm actually drawing on, I know there are several audience members who are wondering along these lines of, given everything you both have seen of these systems and the child welfare family regulation system in particular, there are a lot of parent activists. Josh mentioned Joyce McMillan earlier. She's a leader in New York City, pushing back, calling for abolition at this point of the family regulation system. And I'm going to ask you both, maybe Josh, starting with you, what you would say broadly, but specifically to law students who feel the pull of an abolition argument, that it's time to tear this down, but also who are learning the tools to work within that system.
I feel like it was a rhetorical moment a couple of years ago, and maybe it's faded, that we talked about the Overton window, like shifting the boundaries of the conversation. And when I was in the NYU Family Defense Clinic in 1992, 93, we were astonished as naive law students about how punitive and regressive the system was. But there wasn't a conversation about abolition. And the fact that we're having that conversation certainly moves the goalpost. It forces people to explain why, to justify what they're doing, to articulate what's the purpose of the way the system functions, and not to just have everybody move along and lockstep and say, this is how it works. And that's an important conversation to have, even if you're going to be laughed out of court, even if what you're describing is a world that may be far away. At the same time, when you have a client and you are in a courtroom, your obligation is to the client, and you have to represent that client, and you have to take direction from the client. And I've had colleagues who had capital cases who were unable to raise potentially successful defenses because the client wouldn't let them, even when the outcome was likely to be the client's death. And that's a sacred obligation. I mean, you can't do what the client wants you to do and advance their interests, then you shouldn't be representing that person, and someone else should. So that's the kind of tension that you have in your daily life. You can think big, but you also have to be mindful that if you're a lawyer representing a client, then you have to represent your client.
Andrea, I'm going to give you the last word on what you would say to law students and others who are thinking, questioning, is it time for abolition, or what are the next steps that you, coming off what you've just seen so deeply about these systems, what's your sense of what should come next?
My role is to write about what's happening, not to steer in any way what's happening, although often with deep reporting, one can see impact and change. I think the most kind of fascinating thing about the aftermath of George Floyd and the impact that had on this issue is that it allowed for a reframing of the system, right? So people could, I think one of the challenges with anything is sort of getting people to think outside of the box they're in. And so they'll put something like foster care in a category that, and this is an old issue, and I've heard this story before, and it's decades long, and these are the kids with the worst parents, and they're better off in foster care, all the assumptions that people have. And what if we just forgot about those words for a second and saw this as a totally different thing, which is what by, the leaders that have already come up in this conversation, Joyce McMillan, they've kind of done is sort of rebranded the issue as Black Families Matter. Oh, what does that mean? It causes the passerby who's seeing them marching down to think, well, what are they talking about? What do they mean? Well, what they're talking about is a system that disproportionately affects these families. And by the way, there are many carceral parallels, right? Parallels to the carceral system. And at the same time, a lack of due process that's kind of astounding given the power that these agencies exert. I mean, to break that particular relationship up without sometimes even a court order, just based on suspicions, neglect charges, when the parents don't know they have a right to a lawyer. It's kind of fascinating. It's kind of a huge story once you see it in a through a different lens of language. And I think that for journalists is I've seen some really great reporting done in the last year, especially around that. I have and it's been about that. It's like, well, why don't we reconsider it from this vantage point? Then
there were a lot of people kind of in the family defense world kind of tearing their hair out at the outrage about families being separated at the border by the Trump administration. And
right.
And people said, this is happening every day in New York City, in every city. This is what the child welfare system does. It's the same thing.
Well, really, Andrea, no one's done more to push outside those boxes and help us see things more deeply. My sincere thanks to both of you for the conversation today, for your work, and thank you to everybody who's joined us here for this discussion.
Thank you so much for having us, Chris, and to everyone here.
Thank you.